result what we can have here. And now I will get much more closer to our investigations of the mummy. So there were severe questions about, was he really coming from the south? Didn't he come from the north? Because there were investigations on the height of the Iceman, and the results from the height suggested he was coming from the north. Therefore, it was quite interesting for us to make investigations on the body, and particularly on the intestines. So there were several surgery interventions. What you can see here is a cross-section through the lower part of the thorax, of the breast. You can see in central the spine, above these, excuse me, these thin layers. It doesn't function very well. A thin layer which corresponds to the bowel, and then you have the bigger one which corresponds to the stomach, the gaster. And out of these we collected then ingesta, so the remains of the foodstuff in his intestines, and you can see these tiny little crumbles, which is completely desiccated food remains. So we have collected completely 5 different sites, from the end of the small bowel, the cecum, and then from the transverse colon at the beginning, the number 2, and in the middle part, the number 3, and then number 4, what we're having at the end of the colon, at the sigmoid part, and then the last one comes from the rectum. So this is just a bigger picture of one of these ingesta, where you can see easily there are sinews, you can see remains of testa from cereals, you can see tiny little hairs coming from cereals, and you can see a dark brown mass. If we dehydrate these things, then you can see precisely the testa and pericarp remains of cereals, and this brownish amorphous mass with black dots inside. These are charcoal, but also in there you find a lot of other information by pollen, muscle fibers, and other DNA. So if we look a little bit closer about these macro remains, you can see we have here macro remains from einkorn, precisely shown on the tube cells, glooms from a wheat, most probably einkorn in this case, vessel elements with spiral thickenings and single perforations, which are very common in families with edible plants. So there are big families like the rose family or the legumes in this case, which you have a huge amount of edible plants, and it's difficult to sort them out. We also found stone cells, but we can't tell the species, and at least we found a lot of pollen I will talk later about. So what we found else is a lot of charcoal, charcoal from the pine larix type in this case. So this tells us that the food was prepared on open fire. And then we also have a lot of eggs of the human whipworm, Trichuris trichiura. He had a severe infection of these worms. We also had around about 20 different diatoms in his stomach. So the diatoms were analyzed, and they are coming from glacier-fed rivulets of this area. So we know that he drank water out of them and used this to prepare his meals. And we have also several mineral particles which mostly come from grinding cereals. And what we else have are muscle fibers. And so these muscle fibers indicate us all that he had consumed meat and not only vegetarian food as suggested by others. So what you can see here are more or less the detailed investigations of the macro remains, and you can see with this red square that these are all cereal remains, and the arrows point to chenopods as well to bracken, which most probably seem to be part of his diet, and the blue rectangular shows the amount of muscle fibers. So the muscle fibers are quite interesting, and therefore we did some testing just to have an impression first if there were eaten different muscles, so we can measure the thickness of the muscle fibers. And you can see that there are significant differences in between the last meal coming from the small bowel and the other meals which he had before. So there were also DNA analysis on these material, and Rollo and his team found out that the last meat consisted of red deer, and the other one from the end of the colon consisted of ibex meat. So this gives us an ingestion that what we have here are at least 2 meals. But to sum up is what we can say for the moment is that the Iceman had an intentional ingestion of a cereal, primitive wheat called einkorn, then bracken, chenopods of the goose food family, and roe deer and ibex meat. So now we are also interested in this intestinal pollen flora. Now, this intestinal pollen flora can yield a lot of information, but before we are going to discuss the results, we need to have an imagination how this pollen flora is built up. So there's one part which is marked in red, that we have a pollen source which is an edible plant. And this edible plant, or to this edible plant, always stick pollen, and we consume this pollen intentionally, and therefore we call these pollen source the economic pollen. And this tells us a little bit about what has been eaten. On the other hand, everybody who suffers on hay fever knows that a lot of pollen is airborne, and this pollen is in the air, settles on water, could be part of the meal production, or on the other hand could be drunken by the Iceman and becomes part of the ingesta. In the same way, it is taking up when we respire, and so it sticks to the mucus, but the mucus then is swallowed, and we also add this part of pollen to the ingesta. This part of pollen is unintentional, consumed, and reflects the vegetation where I stayed for a longer time. So this pollen is called background pollen. We need this theory a little later. So first, what we have here are the pollen analysis of the ingesta. You can see only bar codes, which is not so important, and I'm not going to explain it. All what we get is here that we have a lot of pollen from cereals in there, and this confirms even that the Iceman has consumed this